Okay, so.
And now it is being recorded.
Okay. I was just going to start it, but somebody else did. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Howard. And Howard's helping us with the tech today. We also have a team of interns actually from the movement who've joined in, and Anya, Christiane, Ibrahim. In the very at this point unlikely event that we had more than 30 people, we were going to do 3 breakout groups, and they were going to help us do note-taking and recording. Of course, now we will not. But that's the team, and you've met the rest of the MCLD team, comprising of people from different organizations. So next slide, please. We've already done the introductions, but the only thing that I do want to do is the land acknowledgement. I am in Canada, and I know in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, as in many parts of the world now, we have a tradition of starting with land acknowledgements to recognize the historical context of the place that we are in, you know, to kind of take time to step back and think about the land, the relationship, and the history of colonialism that has not just preceded us, but that continues to be there today. So land acknowledgements are also an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring Indigenous people who've been living and working on the land from time immemorial. So if you know whose land you are on, then please do put in the land acknowledgement in the chat box. I'm in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So, next slide, please. You have probably seen this already if you've attended other sessions, but there is an ABCD ebook coming up, which is co-created, and it has recordings. It will have recordings from this year's unconference session as well. Next slide, please. Again, I don't think we're gonna have a lot of this, but if we do, these are some things about troubleshooting tech issues. I think the biggest tech issue at this point probably is how do we get people who are probably in the waiting room in here, but till then, if there's anything, Hurd's also agreed to be with us through the meeting, so he will be there to help us with it. And with this,
just so you know, the waiting room is now disabled, so anybody can join at any time.
Oh, cool.
Oh, thank you. All right. So now we actually get to the agenda of today's meeting and what we are talking about. So community-led development, locally led development, community-driven development, ABCD. I guess there are so many names that are floating around at this point, but essentially the idea of communities being front and center in development is something that has been gaining traction for a few years now, but especially since the pandemic, right? There has been this growing recognition that communities are front and center in development. They are the first responders in any crisis. They are the ones who are going to be there when everybody else parachutes out of the communities. So this whole development paradigm that we had kind of implemented over the last few decades really needs a rethink. The challenge has been that while there is now realization and intent, there isn't really a good understanding of, well, okay, so what does it mean to be community-led? How can we be community-led? What can we do to be community-led? Are we truly being community-led, right? And so we in the movement have been having this problem have been hearing this for a very, very long time. And what we did was, and you'll hear more about this as we go through today's session, is that we talked about, we came together, many organizations, many individuals from all over the world came together, and we developed this tool, which we're going to be talking about today, the CLD Assessment Tool. And this tool, this session was designed really to introduce professionals to this tool, to the participatory process that underpins it, right? The manner in which it can be used to not just assess how community-led our programs are, but to ensure that we become more community-led. And that's the intent of this tool and the purpose of this session, really, to introduce people to it. The session is going to be in 3 parts. The first part is really going to look at a little bit of the background of the tool. How was it created? It's always nice to know how something was being created before we actually start thinking about using it. So the first part is going to be about really a little bit of the background, but then doing a little bit of a deeper dive into what are the CLD characteristics, right? What are the dimensions in this tool? Why are we measuring what we are trying to look at? Why are we looking at it? What's going on here? The second part of the session is actually a simulation, which would have been in breakout groups had the numbers been different. For now, we will just do it together as a group. And the simulation is about the participatory process through which we use the tool. And finally, we'll come back to, we will be here. So we will talk about now that once we use the tool, once we go through that participatory process with the communities, with the different people involved in a program or in a project or in an initiative or anything that we are doing, what do we do with the results? So how do we interpret the results? What do they mean? And then also just get some of your feedback on the tools themselves, on the tool itself. So with that, actually, I think I'm going to hand it over to Nelly.
Sure. I think we can skip the poll. We all know who each other are. We know where we're calling from. What we don't know, at least Ron, Gord, and Ashley, although Gunjan might know for Gord, is where are you in your ABCD or CLD journey? Is this something that is deeply familiar to you, you've been working on for a long time, or is it something that you're learning about, coming to recently? Those are not necessarily contradictions. I think one can be have been working on it for a long time and still be at the beginning of one's journey with it. I think we're all still learning, but yeah, just curious to hear from you all quickly how familiar, where you are in these ideas.
Sure. Just really quick, in my own personal experience, it's been a little over 20 years. I've been trying to learn from successful community-led development and try to build the lessons from that into approaches for partners of Cody's to actually approach communities differently, work with communities differently. And we sort of adopted the ABCD language about the same time as we started doing this. But the Institute itself has a history of almost 100 years. At least our university rested in an economic and social movement known as the Untitled movement that was, I think, the epitome of community-led development, in which a huge cooperative movement in this part of the country was formed by people coming together, using what they have to secure what they have not, and building all kinds of collective agency, and in the process, producer networks of producer cooperatives, which were community-owned, not just community-led. So I draw a straight line between our modern-day language around ABCD and the history of this place.
If I can just quickly, sorry, Nelly, quickly ask, when you say place, Gord, what institution are you talking about?
Gord, you're muted.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. The Cody Institute's located on the campus of St. Francis Xavier University. That's the just our institute's buildings behind me. There's 2 buildings on the campus, which is in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, which is northeast Nova Scotia, about 2 hours from Halifax, which is the capital of the province.
Great, thanks.
I definitely want to go and learn more about that history. Ron, you gave us just a little bit. But...
I was actually fortunate enough to meet the ABCD concepts in 1989 when Jody Kretzman and I were introduced, and they were, I think at the time, putting together the Green Book. I don't think it was out yet, Building Community from the Inside Out, and have continued to have Jody in my head and in my ear through all my jobs in the community development field, trying to get nonprofits, mostly large nonprofits, to get out of the way of communities and use their power and resources to create space for ABCD. So it's been a long journey, and I feel like every day it's a new journey. So I'm really excited to see what you guys have here.
Amazing. And Ashley, if you're able, there you go.
Hi there. Yeah, so our family has been learning alongside other families in Cincinnati and now beyond that about asset-based community development. We were fortunate enough that our mentor was kind of like inviting us to a lot of different things, but he said, but this one, John McKnight will be at, and like, you don't want to miss it. And so I brought my daughter, who was, I think, 1.5 at the time. And so what we're learning is how to create sparks that lead to connections, that lead to relationships that support families and their children with disabilities, that extend beyond what services offer and offer a more organic and long-term support for our families. So that includes our family, but also I'm in the Family Leadership Network. And so we're leading other families to learn alongside us. So we've been doing that, I don't know, maybe 5 years. So I'm still kind of new compared to some of you.
Thank you, Ashley. And that is amazing in the breadth of experience with this. And one thing we'll come back to later is that, you know, we do trainings on this tool, but this tool is a living, breathing, growing, evolving tool. And I can imagine that we may come out of this. This may be more of a training for us in how to adapt the tool rather than a training to you of how to use the tool, but we'll see. Sarah, you can go to the next slide. I think it sounds like Gord definitely knows about the movement. I'm not sure about Ashley or Ron. So I'll just give a super quick introduction to it. Movement for Community-Led Development was launched in 2015 at the same time, on the same day, in fact, as the Sustainable Development Goals were announced and adopted in the UN. And essentially, you know, a group of organizations recognized that the SDGs were a very important milestone, but also recognized that the only way that it was at all possible to achieve them was if communities were really front and center in development and in this journey. So today the movement has grown to being over 1,500 local civil society organizations, as well as some 72 INGOs, international organizations. The Global Secretariat is housed at the Hunger Project, and Gunjan and many of the folks on this call work with the Secretariat, but the movement actually works through national chapters. There's 17 right now and more emerging as we speak, as well as a whole host of different working groups. And all of these groups convene and collaborate on various initiatives, peer learning and exchange, and research projects, of which this tool came from one of. Sarah, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So Gunjan mentioned that we'll tell you a little bit about the background of this tool. So this was a collaborative research initiative that started in 2019 at its most basic to understand what community-led development means to those who are doing it. As Gunjan said, you know, a lot of people talk about it. It's becoming a very, a much more used and common term in development, but there isn't really consensus on what that means. So our questions were, you know, what are organizations doing when they say they're doing community-led development? And importantly, what is the impact of that work? And how do we measure that impact? So it was clear that no one organization could answer that when so many people have been doing this and feel strongly about it and connected to it. So a group of some 35 CLD professionals from 23 different organizations from all over the world came together to explore these questions and work through them. Next slide, please. And then, so we broke out into 3 groups on the screen there to answer these sort of 3 central questions. Again, what is CLD? What is it? What does it do? And how do we capture its impact? And then there was also an advisory group of academics and very senior practitioners who reviewed and guided our work. And so then from this work, there came 3 products, which were all released in January and are all on the MCLD website for anyone to explore. So the first was a landscape of CLD based on program documents from 173 programs in 65 countries. And that was looking at, again, you know, what are the actual activities that people are doing when they say they do CLD? Then there was a CLD assessment tool that organizations and soon communities can apply to see where they are in their CLD journey and how we can strengthen our own practice. Oh, thanks, Sarah. And that's the tool that we will talk about today. And then finally, there was a quality appraisal tool specifically designed for evaluation of community-led programs. So this CLD assessment tool is the one for today, and it was meant to be applicable for organizations who, you know, have very different focuses, come from different contexts, use different facilitation approaches. So therefore, you know, it was meant to be applied widely, and it was meant to be used internally to reflect and learn for ourselves where we want our programming to go. I'm not sure if the next slide adds anything, so we can test it. We might stick on this one. No, we can go back to the other one. So it's based on 9 dimensions, this tool, and Gunjan's going to go over all of those dimensions in a bit more detail later. But there was a whole process to coming to these 9 dimensions. First, there was extensive discussion across, you know, this wide range of practitioners where we identified, based on experience and discussion and our learning, you know, what are some of the key characteristics of CLD? Once we had a hypothesis around that, we triangulated, obviously, with, you know, a very extensive literature review. And then we looked at what these characteristics look like across sort of the life cycle of a program. And from that, we ended up distilling these 9 dimensions. As I said, it's a living, breathing, evolving tool. It's participatory, and it's been tested now and revised by organizations and practitioners in Africa and Asia and Latin America, as well as Europe and North America. And, you know, it's being used currently by organizations in Zambia and DRC, Benin, Myanmar, Philippines, Mexico, in many different places. We mentioned we're doing trainings on this tool, and we're developing a version that communities can use as well to assess and think about the programming that they're doing in their own villages or spaces. But we will continue to refine it. We're going to continue to, you know, see how these dimensions resonate with different practitioners, how the tool as a way to think about and reflect on these 9 dimensions, how that works. So we are, you know, continuing to grow it, and this training, I think, as I mentioned, will probably end up being more of an assessment that we can use on the tool. Now you can go to the next slide, Sarah. So I'm going to hand it over to Gunjan in just a second to go over those 9 dimensions, but this is just a smattering of the faces of the core team that were involved in developing this tool, and we just wanted to acknowledge all of their work. Gunjan, over to you to tell us about the dimensions. And if anybody has questions on the process or, you know, what comes next, I'm sure we can talk about that at some point.
Yeah, thank you, Nellie. And yes, so this is the core team that developed the tool. We had many people from all over coming in and giving inputs, helping us refine it, helping us test it at many points. I would have loved to put everybody's names and faces on slides. We would have just gone through that for the rest of the session. And so we just decided to put the core team out there. But I just want to acknowledge the fact that there were so many organizations, small and big, from all over, who put in a lot of time, a lot of pro bono time, because none of this work was funded by anyone to do this work. And I see that we have one more person who's joined us, Delphin, so welcome. Delphin, today what we're doing is that we've changed, because we're such a small group, we've changed the rules of engagement a little bit here. And so at any point, if you have a question, if you have a thought, a concern, an idea, just feel free to unmute and share, or to use the chat box, whatever you're more comfortable with. So we did very quickly go over a little bit of the background about the tool that we are at today. And now we're going to head over to the interesting part of it. We were going to do this in polls, and I'm thinking it may actually still, the word clouds may still be fun to do, Sarah. So why don't we go to the next slide? We won't do a poll, but since all of you, I don't know, Daphne, about you so much, but I know for the others who've been here, have been associated working on ABCD. In fact, I think for way longer than we have been. So if you were to associate one word, you know, if you were to think of, and they can be, you can put in 21 words, but if you were to think of words that describe ABCD, characteristics, what it is about, what it stands for, what would they be? And we have a poll EV link here, which I'm also going to put in the chat box to make it simple for everyone. But if you just go there, you can put in the words, and we will actually see a word cloud around it, which is a fun thing to see. But if people find that uncomfortable, we can just talk about it. But there is a reason why we do the word clouds, and I'll come to that. So if you just go to this poll EV thing, you'll see a question there. And Sarah, maybe you can put up the poll EV screen, please.
Just ask where I was from. Oh, here we go.
Oh, is it working?
Sorry, I just had to skip the ones that we skipped as well.
Oh. And put in as many one words as you think are relevant, but essentially words that you would use to describe ABCD. Wonderful. It's definitely powerful. It's about the collective, Indigenous people. It's about citizen power, solution-focused, strength-based, collaboration, assets and resources. Hopeful, for sure. It's a gift. It's about action. Inside out, ownership, local ownership, and I see that becoming big. Wonderful. So the reason I was doing this was that you'll see a lot of these terms that come up, and keep adding more terms if there are more things that you think of are key characteristics of ABCD or what you associate with ABCD. But you'll see them coming up as we talk about the characteristics of CLD. So our next question was really going to ask you to talk about what comes to mind when you hear the word community-led development. And what we were going to go from there was to really try and understand the connection between ABCD and CLD. But again, like I said, we are adapting. And I think given the audience and the people that we have today with us, We probably already have that. So instead of doing that on poll, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just ask, does anyone here want to talk about and tell me what they see are the connections between CLD and ABCD? Are we talking about the same thing? Are we talking about slightly different things? Is there a very strong overlap? Do they feed into each other? What is it that people see? Feel free to just unmute and speak up.
I'll take a first swing at this. Cody Institute has a long history of, as I mentioned, not just coming out of a local movement, but also in the international development field. Over the last couple of decades, I've gotten to know Ron and Howard and many of the other folks in the ABCD movement. I realize there's quite a difference in history in terms of international development. So the whole field of participatory approaches, PRA, PLA, you just go on and on, are not particularly known in the North American context. Now, I know that Howard and Ron and others know about these things, but when we talk about ABCD a lot in the Canadian or US context, it's a lot about neighborhood or residency-based or local community organizing. And it's about, it's not so much about the intermediary. In the international development field, a lot of the work around being more participatory is because international NGOs, national NGOs, even indigenous NGOs, as well as local governments have been trying to figure out how to work in community and how to do it effectively. And those are quite different fields, or they've emerged as quite different fields. So sometimes we tend to talk past each other. I think you've got the right people in the room who do kind of get both, but it is possible to be talking past each other if you don't have the folks who understand the history of both.
Thank you, God. Anyone else wants to talk about what they see as connections or how they see CLD or ABCD?
I think the connection I've always seen is, well, at their best, I think they work the same. I think ABCD, and I can't speak to variations of CLD at all, but I know ABCD sometimes gets sort of used for purposes that aren't community-led. So that agencies can say, we looked at the community assets and here's how we're going to meet their needs. But I think when done well, ABCD results in community feeling like it can lead its development because it has some things to work with that it owns. And that's why it can be really empowering. So I see it often as or I experience it as a step towards helping a community believe in itself and that it can do some things and therefore negotiate with government and other more traditional powers on more solid ground and with more confidence, which then leads to more inclination towards community-led development. But I'm not sure that ABCD in itself has a great path for that as much as getting you to that path.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ron. And this is why I was like, instead of me trying to do this, I know there are people in the room who will do this better. So thank you. But absolutely. And like ABCD in CLD, Ron, we have the same issue as well. We've just finished phase 2 of our research. So we first looked at in our phase 1, as Nelly said, we looked at 173 programs across 65 countries. And in the second phase, where we did a much more deeper dive, we did a rapid realist review. We looked at 56 programs in a lot of depth. And both cases, we found the same thing, that, well, sometimes you just go, you ask a community to give, to put in labor, and you ask them to put in, to provide materials or space, or you tell them to implement the program or run a center, and then you say you're doing, and you believe you're doing community-led development. Not really. And I think a lot of people here would also be familiar with Arnstein's ladder of participation and all. So I think these are things across the board, ABCD, CLD, or anytime when we talk about participation. It's something that does come in a lot in terms of, well, what is it? Are you just going out and extracting from the communities resources, knowledge, skills, time, information? Is that really CLD? Is that what ABCD is really about? Or is it that you are supporting communities as they use their own knowledge, skills, resources, and supporting them with whatever additionality they need to do the things that they want to do and they believe are important, right? And part of the idea behind this tool is to help us as organizations, as implementers and practitioners, to constantly ask ourselves that question in our work and to actually go through that process to see what we are doing. But if we move to the slide deck, and Sarah, I'm going to apologize to you in advance because I'm going to make you do a lot of skipping of slides back and forth since we are changing and adapting the program completely now. But so if you put up the slide deck, please bear with us, everyone. Putting the emphasis on community-led or citizen-led, putting the emphasis on agency rather than as.
And we also have 2 new people who've joined the group, Gunjan. Hope and Mary.
Mary, Hope. Wonderful. So for everyone who's joining in, this session is being run much more informally than a lot of Zoom meetings that you're used to. We encourage you to share your views, to speak up, to put it in the chat box as you hear us, and it's going to be all about questions and us engaging. So it's really going to be less of us telling you, but more of us having a conversation and discussion around the tool, around the characteristics, and making sense of it together and learning from it together. Also, if you've just joined us, I would encourage you to please introduce yourselves in the chat box so that we know who you are. Thank you. Okay, so Sarah, if you can skip through some of this, the CLD and the ABCD slides, and go to the 9 dimension slide. Thank you. So Nelly talked about the process that we talked, that we had to come to this tool and to develop this tool. We went through extensive consultation, literature reviews and stuff, and we identified 11 characteristics of CLD. We didn't have time in this training to actually, talk about 11 characteristics and then how we move from characteristics to dimensions and all of it. But if I had shown you those 11 characteristics, you would see that so many of them were very similar to what we talked about in ABCD as well. But then because we were all practitioners, we wanted to say, yeah, fine. So we have these characteristics. That's wonderful. We have some good documents talking about characteristics as well. What next? What does it mean in practice? And that's what these 9 dimensions in the tool are about. These are about how do the characteristics of community-led development appear in practice? What does it mean? Where do they appear during different points in the programming or in a project? And is there anything out here which is a surprise for anyone? Let's talk about that before we delve into anyone. Is there any one of these 9 dimensions that you're like, I didn't think this would be there? Why is this there?
Well, just to elaborate on what I was saying earlier, that this is really clearly community-led development as defined by an external organization, that we want to promote more community-led development rather than, endogenous rather than exogenous development. Communities, when they're doing this, don't use this kind of language because it's a given. It's an internal process, but that's what I'm saying is a big difference between a lot of the North American context and the international development context is a lot of the focus is on how to have the intermediary organization behave differently. And so this is about how the intermediary organization can promote or stimulate, support, respond to community-led development, as opposed to how communities themselves organize and lead their own development.
God, that is a very important distinction. And yes, so just to go back very quickly to something that Nelly had maybe not really touched upon, we didn't do that in the introduction, but the tool that was developed, this tool came up as a response to a need that was expressed by organizations, right? But these were a group of INGOs and local CSOs. So there were national and local, but they were all organizations. So in that sense, they weren't community-based organizations, right? They weren't organizations that came from communities and were in communities, but these were all organizations which were some kind of a civil society NGO thing. So in that sense, they were all external in some ways, but we all wanted to figure out how do we do this work better and how do we support communities? And that was the purpose of this tool. So absolutely, that is a very important context to remember as we go through this. But what's been interesting for us in this journey over we launched the tools in January after almost, I think, 18 months plus of discussion, revisions, testing, piloting, and everything. And what's been very interesting to us is that when we launched the tool, if you would have attended our launch session, you would have heard clearly there, God, I think you were there. So you probably heard us say, well, this is really a tool for, INGOs and NGOs and others to think about the work that we do. And then since then, we started hearing from a lot of governments, for instance, coming and saying, well, can you train us on using this tool? Like, train you on using this tool, like how, why? And their idea was, well, the principles are the same. A lot of the principles of what we need to be careful of in our work is the same, right? When we talk about devolution, when we talk about our programming, we want to see if this is happening. So can you do that? And then we had a lot of smaller organizations coming in and saying, well, yeah, but we want to use this in the communities. The fact is that this is not the language that any community member speaks of. Exit strategies, responsiveness to context, facilitation, sustainability, even we in the development sector can't agree on what these terms mean. Even we continue to have like zillion papers and papers on them and kind of debating and disputing each other's views and definitions on this. And then we're going out and we are saying we want to include communities in this process. And then we want them to talk about, well, does the organization actually, is that exit strategy for this program designed with you? If I was a community member, I would be like, really? Sure. Do you want to start with telling me what is the exit strategy we are talking about? And so completely take your point. And one of the things that we are doing right now that Nelly touched upon is that we actually have a group of people who worked on taking this tool, but converting it to see what would the version look like if it was free of all our development sector jargon. What would it look like for community members to truly use this tool without the need of somebody coming and explaining every word to them to put it in context, right? What would that look like? And can we create a tool that is more, that can be adapted by, say, governments, local governments and others as in trainings for their people, which is how we are going to be using the training the local government folks to understand what would true community engagement mean like. So we actually have that version of the tool, which is now being piloted, it's been developed. So hopefully that will be less of the sector jargon, and it will also be something which is more in tune with some of what CBOs want. But yes, this particular tool absolutely is within that framework. Any other thoughts that come to mind when you see these dimensions within the frame of what we're talking? Nope. Okay, so I am going to move ahead. So our initial plan had been that we were going to actually connect and see how these work with ABCD and explore that, but we're not going to do that now. I think what's going to be more useful is that we are going to delve a little bit into each of these dimensions and try to unpack them and see what they stand for and what they mean before we move to the tool and see the participatory process that underpins the tool. God, I see you unmuted yourself.
Well, the only thing that, so thanks for clarifying that. I mean, that's how I felt about it. And certainly anybody most of the people coming to CODI courses from international development organizations would totally look at this and say, yeah, you've captured it, I think. The thing that I've certainly noticed working with a lot of INGOs and trying to apply an ABCD approach over time is that their role shifts from an active facilitation role, entering the community differently, not bringing projects and programs, but coming in to listen and to help the community see itself differently. And then as the community starts mobilizing as low-hanging fruit and going to higher hanging fruit, the role of the organization shifts to much more of a connector or a supporter, responsive investor, as I would say, to what the community is already doing. I've seen that take many different forms, but that's sort of the general way in which I've seen it unfold. And so it's a dynamic situation rather than a static in which there are, depending on what stage of the process, there are different areas to really dimensions, as you say.
Absolutely. And so one of our thoughts when we were designing the tool, and when we show you the tool and we do the simulation, and I just had a time check from one of my colleagues, I didn't even realize we were already almost halfway through the session. So we will get on quickly now to the tool and the dimensions. But one of the things that we actually did, the tool, when you see it, and Sarah is going to do a walkthrough on the tool, you'll see that we designed it as a rubric. It's not designed as a checklist where you go like, oh, are we doing this? Yes, brilliant. Let's give us, points and then pat ourselves on the back and move forward. It's designed as a rubric precisely because it understands the fact that context matters, right? We all talk about it, but we forget about it when we're actually doing the work. So context matters. Not all things are possible at every point in a project or a program. They're not possible in every situation, right? It depends on the country situation, on the local situation. It depends on so many things. And that's why the tool, when you see it, is designed as a rubric, which gives you a menu of options. And it doesn't say, the aspiration is not for you to be 100% on this tool, and so you're doing great work and you can. The whole idea and the process of using this tool is to talk to the community about each one of these things and see how you're doing, where the satisfaction is and where the dissatisfaction is, to see what is possible at that point. So the way to use this tool is not to aspire for a 100% score on it, get a spider graph that is at the edges of it and yay, and move on. And that's why we focus so much in the trainings on the process of using the tool. Because exactly for that purpose, God, because we recognize that CLD looks different in different contexts at different points, and it has to look that way. If it wasn't, then it wouldn't be CLD. So the tool and the process is designed for that. Okay, what I'm going to do now is we are going to quickly move on, and we're going to go over some of these dimensions. We're not going to go into all because I thought that we would, and then I realized that no, we don't have that much time. So we're going to delve into some of these, and the idea is to show you how we've been thinking about these dimensions, why we were conceptualizing these dimensions in a particular way in the tool, so that when you see the tool and the questions, you see that. Next slide, please, Sarah. So one of the things that actually, can we move to participation? Maybe Nelly, you can do that. So we can do them a little bit in order, and then I can come back to this. So Nelly, I'll hand it to you.
Great, thank you. And I think actually this point about, where the dimensions are sort of automatically relevant to communities when they're doing this work versus the other dimensions that are, like exit strategy or responsiveness to context. I mean, those are, you're not generally, without external forcing factors, you're not going to be exiting your community, and you're going to be responding to the local context, because that is the only way to respond or act in general. But I actually think this dimension is one that is something that, you know, communities can and should be thinking about in their own engagement with each other, because it's not automatic. It doesn't, you know, participation, inclusion, voice, that doesn't always happen in communities when they're working together. So we can come back to that, but I just think this is a really interesting one for that point. And it's also clearly sort of, you know, at the core of CLD, certainly ABCD, et cetera. It's really sort of perhaps the most important dimension, and therefore it was the first one that emerged in the tool. So obviously, you know, participation, inclusion, voice are very large terms, are very intertwined. They sort of potentially lead to one another. But like all of these things, we don't necessarily always talk about them in the same way. Don't always know what they mean. You know, this question that came up earlier about how to, you know, when can this kind of work become extractive? You know, what is participation that's really giving people voice, and when are we asking for participation in a kind of extractive way? So this dimension, this set of questions in the tool is really to understand, you know, what do we mean by these three characteristics? When do they happen? How do they happen? Who is participating? Who doesn't? Why not? You know, and what is enough, particularly in community development? So I can go through in a moment sort of what are the questions that led us to forming the sub-questions within this dimension and the different, the sort of the scale of the rubric. But before that, I'm curious to hear from all of you, you know, when you're thinking about ABCD in particular, what do these characteristics, participation, inclusion, voice, what do they mean for you? When do they come up? What is a measure of there being enough, whatever that might mean? It's a hard question to answer, actually.
I've had groups use the fingerprint methodology, which is how many different fingerprints from the community are on any given project. That if somebody's touched the project in a way that and helped it move forward, that's a fingerprint, and then they count those up as a measure of participation over time.
And so how does that get broken up, right? Like if we're thinking about the fingerprints, how would you think about, you know, at what points in a program process is it, if it, you know, is just sort of touched at one point, or is a certain point of being engaged or participating sort of enough or more important than others? Is it just sort of about like a certain quota, not quota, but like, you know, if there's a certain majority or a certain quorum of people from a community who've touched it, is that enough, or does it matter sort of who within the community? Yeah,
I mean, the groups I've worked with that have used a fairly simple way of doing that, just use it as sort of a point in time check on direction. You know, are fingerprints increasing or decreasing? Where are they coming from? Who's not there that we need to reach out to more? So that's mostly how I've seen it done. When I was at a mutual housing organization, we had our community organizers use a more formal way, which was that anything happening in our communities, we would either categorize as staff agency initiated, meaning thought of, and staff agency implemented. So that would be where an agency gets a grant, comes in and does something. Staff agency thought of, but resident initiated. So that's where staff of an agency that worked in our communities might come up with something, but then engage residents in carrying it out. The next one was resident initiated, staff led. So where residents came up with an idea, but staff were carrying it out, you know, like after school program or something. And then the last one was resident initiated, resident led. And we would every month sort of assess all the things that were going on in our communities and how many of them were moving along that continuum towards resident initiated, resident led. And I would evaluate the organizer's performance based on how many groups they were moving towards resident led, if they were developing capacity of people to lead their own things. That was a more formal measure of participation.
Yeah, and that sort of mirrors a bit the thinking that on the participation side came out with this tool as it currently stands, at least, to sort of, you know, is there participation, as you said, in the ideation, in the design, in the implementation, in the exit, in deciding the pace? How does that grow and change? So I think that that's quite similar to the model of on the participation side. And then there's the inclusion side, which you also reference, you know, whose fingertips and who's not. So is it young people, women, elderly, minority groups, disabled people, the poor, you know, I think a trap that can sort of sometimes happen is it has community participation. So people feel like there's inclusion and it's more inside out, but the people who are part of sort of the leadership group that are participating, you know, are elected officials, or they have some sort of inherited authority, or they're making a lot of decisions on other kinds of programming. And so, you know, that is a concentration of power that in some cases can be sort of growing inequity rather than having a wider inclusion into decision making for these kinds of processes. Also, Cord or Ashley or Mary, oh, Ralph, welcome, Ralph. If anybody else has thoughts, Gita, please feel free. I'm really curious to hear how you all think about participation, inclusion. And then the last one is voice. So they're in the room. There's a wide range of people in the room representing all parts of the community, but does their voice, you know, really have an impact on the table? And what are the dynamics that might be preventing people from speaking up or speaking really honestly about what is going on and what the priorities are and what the assets are? Do they have the tools and the confidence and the ability to advocate for themselves and for, you know, others of their community or their sub-community? So, you know, each of these kind of, if you have participation, you're more likely to have inclusion. If you have real inclusion, you're more likely to have voice. And if you have people participate across the process, then their inputs and their voice are going to possibly hold, you know, even more weight, even if they're somebody who's talking to someone who's been like an authority figure, or in some cases, as you know, happens in a lot of communities, somebody who they depend on for work, for their wages, to feed their family. And that can be really hard to speak up in that kind of a environment.
I really like the inclusion of voice in this and not just participation.
Yeah, and very hard to measure.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, where's the slide that has all the tried and true measurement tools?
It's really interesting. We were discussing that this morning, is sort of the critique of ABCD when you can't measure things. And I think having a response to that is critical.
And I'm not sure. I mean, I do think everything is measurable. The key is like, is it measurable in a way that's meaningful to the people involved?
Agreed. Yeah. Thanks, Ron.
I just don't buy that we can't measure this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think in this, and now I'm going off topic, and Gunjan's going to scold me because we are over time. But that's part of how the tool came about, was because without sort of ways to measure or think in a cohesive way about what we're doing, it becomes hard to advocate for this kind of work and this kind of an approach also. So, having some kinds of tools to measure, but that aren't judgmental and aren't trying to say what you're doing doesn't count somehow. That was the challenge of this project. Anyway, with that, Gunjan, back over to you.
Thank you, Nellie. And I'm sorry to cut the discussion. This could be a very interesting discussion. One of the things we realized was that, when we do these trainings, we do extensive certificate trainings in the movement on the tool, is that each one of these dimensions, we can spend so much time discussing and unpacking. And that's part of the process for us also to begin to think about some of this. But in the interest of time, because I realize we still haven't shown you the tool itself or done the simulation, and we are more than halfway through this. So in the interest of time, what we're going to do is that we are going to very quickly, I'm going to touch on 2 more dimensions, not unfortunately going through it in the interactive manner that we initially thought we would, just so that we can get to the tool very quickly. But I do want to unpack to show you how we were thinking of 2 more dimensions to just give you a sense of what are the kind of things that we discussed collectively and extensively as a group, and what are the kind of things we hope people will be thinking about as when they use the tool. And then we will move to actually seeing the tool and a simulation on how the tool is used. So Sarah, if we can go to the slide on local resources, please. And this is also the place where we thought that people would see perhaps the biggest overlap with ABCD in terms of local resources. But the question often for us, at least when we look at CLD work, is that what do you mean by local resources, right? What are we talking about when we are talking about local resources? Anyone, what are we talking about when we talk of local resources? Use the chat box if you want to. But what do we mean when we say local resources? Or say, talk. Yeah, not just financial resources for sure.
I generally use those 6 ABCD buckets of people, associations, institutions, places, economy, and culture and stories.
Absolutely. And so when we were thinking about the tool, one of the challenges is that we don't, in CLD practice often, especially when we're talking of organizations who are going in to implement programs or work with communities on programming, resources often get restricted to either community assets in the form of, land, capital, materials, or time, labor, right? Sometimes knowledge and skills, but there are other resources which get missed out, which is associations, the relationships and connections that exist in a community, perhaps one of our biggest resources. And so in this tool, we look at, and I'm seeing some very interesting things coming up on how communities define resources and what community resources can be. So thank you for that. So the way in this tool we've looked at it is that we want people to think about, when they're thinking about local resources and knowledge, to think about not just land, tangible resources or time, but to also think about the connections, the institutions, and the other things which are actually exist in communities, the knowledge which exists. And then the second thing that we look on in this dimension is that, Sarah, if you can double click, please. The second thing that we look at in this dimension is not just, because remember the context in which we're talking about this tool, right? We're talking about the context in which there is an external actor of some sort involved in supporting the community in this process, right? So it's not just about recognizing and using the tools, but it's also about, are you valuing them? Are you placing them at par, right? What's that looking like? So those are the two things that we look at in this dimension in the tool. And with this, I'm going to quickly move to the third dimension that I want to talk about, and then head over to the tool. So Sarah, if we go to M&E. So a lot of the tools, a lot of the things, if you remember anything about the 9 dimensions that we spoke about at the beginning, that we have in this tool: participation, inclusion, voice, accountability, sustainability, local resources, working with governments. A lot of these dimensions are almost self-explanatory, but one of the things that we came across a lot was that when we were talking about the tool, often the question that would come up would be on monitoring and evaluation and learning, right? Ron, you just talked about, well, everything can be measured. It's about for whom and who uses that knowledge, right? And one of the challenges often, if you look at INGOs or NGOs or even local CSOs doing community-led development work, is that, well, when it comes to monitoring and evaluation, what are they monitoring? What are they measuring? What are they evaluating is often dictated by funders or by their own considerations, and have very little bearing on, well, what is it that the community would like to know? How would they measure the success of a project? How would they measure impact? What is important to them, right? How often do projects see that? We looked at 173 projects across 65 countries, as I said, by a whole lot of organizations. Not even 2 of those 173 projects had that aspect built into it. And so this is all going back to this whole point of being extractive for us. For this tool, it was extremely important that if you're talking of community-led development, we have to recognize that the principles of community leadership, of community deciding, of determining what is important, what to do, how to do, is done with communities. It's not an external process. That MEL cannot be something external where you just go to the community, you ask them for information, or you train a bunch of people from the community as enumerators, right, to collect the data that you want, and then you come around and say, yay, we did it, you know, we consulted the community. Well, it was community-led, you know, the information was gathered by community members. That's not what community-led MEL is, right? And so the basic principle for us when we were thinking of monitoring and evaluation and learning for community-led development is the fact that it is not extractive. And if communities have to make decisions about what they need to do and how they need to run programs and what programs should they run and what initiatives should they take, they need data and information, and they know what data and information they need. And so we identified 5 steps in the cycle of community-led MEL, which are part of this tool. Sarah, if you do a rapid series of clicks, we will see all of them. So for us, monitoring and evaluation for community-led development projects in this tool is about community voice in every step of the process, which means from what data should be collected, what should we measure, what is going to be important for us, right? What are our objectives and goals with the work that we are doing? And how are we going to measure the success of that work? To who will collect the data? How will we analyze this data? How will we make sense of it? Right? Who is doing that analysis and making sense of it? Because so many times it's always the external. So the community provides the data and then an external actor goes and analyzes it. You don't know so many things about the community and you can't make sense of it or know the context of it. So it's a process that has to happen with communities. And finally, for communities to know back, to hear back the results of that evaluation, the results of the monitoring and learning exercise. What happened? How is the program doing? How is the work that they are doing? What corrections do they need to make? So the MEL section, the dimension around monitoring and evaluation in the tool, seeks to unpack all of these things and is built on these principles and premises. And with that, I am going to finally, we are going to actually, after all of this discussion, show you what this tool looks like. So Sarah is going to do a very quick tool walkthrough for us. And then what we're going to do is that we are going to, after the walkthrough, look at the participatory process, which to us in some ways is even more important than the tool itself, on how to use it. So Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Before we walk through, I'll just briefly tell you a little bit more about the tool. You heard about the process that Nellie spoke about earlier, where implementing organizations and funders started to ask the research group, well, how do we ensure that we're practicing community-led development? So we realized the need to create a tool that would foster dialogue among different stakeholders. Like Gunjan said, it's really important to note that the tool was needs-based. We designed it to fill a gap. We wanted to give reviewers, stakeholders, a participatory way to look at their programs at different stages. So we took the characteristics of community-led development, looked at how they would appear in the program lifecycle, and the tool was born. It's designed to see how organizations can see how well their work is community-driven and adjust their programming if necessary. But as you've heard, it can also be used as a capacity building tool by funders and CSOs to ensure that their work is indeed community-led. The most important point that Gunjan has already made is that it's not an impact assessment tool, and it's not a tool that we designed to say that you're doing bad community-led development or good community-led development. It's a learning-based tool designed to allow organizations to see where they are in their CLD journey and how they can become more focused on the communities that they're working with. We know the tool could be used by one person or solely on reports, but we strongly recommend that it be used in a participatory process like we'll do in a few minutes, in a way that involves all partners, stakeholders, and even the community members, most importantly. So the tool can be used at any stage of the program lifecycle, and it can be used to understand how the community views the program and its processes. So it's available in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish, and in 2 formats, the Excel version for M&E staff and a mobile and tablet version that's really easily accessible. So right now I'm gonna switch sharing and show you the mobile version. Just bear with me while I switch screens. Hopefully that's the right screen. So we realized that Excels can be a little bit intimidating, and we wanted something that would be really user-friendly. So you can use the tool as the mobile version. It will store data on your phone or computer. So when you use it, we won't see your data. When you open it for the first time, you can choose your language at the top left. This is the English version, of course, but there's a French version and a Spanish version as well. So the first page is just an overview with basic information on how to use the tool, when to use it, define some of the key terms, and what to do. On the next page, you'll see a list of the 9 dimensions of CLD, and you can come back to this page as needed if you want to go back to one of your answers. Then you can fill in your basic program information, when was the tool first used, who used it, and you can put in the stage so that you can easily come back and use the tool again at a later stage. Then as you begin to move through, you'll see the dimensions and the sub-questions that Nellie mentioned briefly. So you can select the option that fits your program best, you choose a score, and then you can give a reason in the comment section. Please do use the comment section because it will be helpful when you come back at a later stage. You can see your justification for that score. And then you move through, the process is the same for each of the 9 dimensions. They all have the same format. You just continue to move through and assign your scores. And then using the middle arrow that faces upward, you can easily switch back to different dimensions. And when you're ready, you click on the graph tab to see how your program is doing in each dimension. So the first figure shows an overview of all 9 dimensions. For example, on the one that I filled out, we're doing really well. We're at the outside of the spider diagram on CLD linked to subnational governments. And you can see that we have room for improvement on facilitation, investment, and intensity. And you can click through, there's 5 different graphs. So when you go to the next graph, you can see your results Specific to dimension A, participation and inclusion, it will show you your results for each of the sub-questions, and then continue clicking to see other in-depth results for sustainability, and then the last graph shows the results for the two processes, M&E and facilitation. You can also download these graphs and add them easily to your reports. And I know that was a very quick overview, but we're now about to use the tool. We've looked at the tool, we've talked about 3 of the 9 dimensions, and now we're ready to hear about the case study and try to apply the tool ourselves.
Thank you, Sarah. So that was a quick flavor of the tool. Again, we did this very differently from what we had planned because of, a number of reasons. So bear with us. What we're going to do now is, like Sarah showed you the tool. We talked about the dimensions, but I think one of the things you would have kept hearing me say constantly, and Nelly say throughout this, is the most important thing about this tool is not even the dimensions. It's not the scores. It's not the graphs that you get at the end of it. It is really the process of using this tool that defines it. So what we're going to do now is going to do a quick simulation of that process. What is the process and why is it that we use that process? So Sarah is going to put into the chat box a quick link for a case study. It's a one-pager. What we're going to do is that we're going to give everybody a few minutes, 3 minutes or so, to very quickly read this one-pager. And then we are going to imagine that we are community members who are different members, program team communities. You can decide what you want to be, it doesn't matter. But we are actually going to apply that tool, 1 or 2 questions on this case study to see what is the process that we recommend for using this tool. So is everybody able to click on the case study? If you're not, let us know. We actually also had a recording that we were going to play for people who prefer the audio version. But I wonder if, please raise your hands, use the raise hand button if you want us to play the recording. Otherwise, we can just give everybody 3 or 4 minutes to simply read this case.
Sweet.
And Sarah, what we can then do is maybe instead we can just put up the case study on your screen and screen share. Patrick. And make it slightly bigger so that it's easy to read. Perfect. Thank you. Sarah, maybe we can gradually start scrolling a little down so that people, if they're reading it here, can see more. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Has everyone read the case study in one place or the other? Can we start? If you haven't, that's fine, just say so, but otherwise we will begin. And the link is here, so you will, you can keep reading it and referring to the case study, but I'm going to ask my colleague Eileen now to take us through the simulation where we will look at, well, how is this program doing?
Sure thing, Kunjan. So I'm gonna, Sarah, if you don't mind, maybe just share that third slide of the breakout group. And whilst you pull that up, Sarah, I just want to share at our organization, just to reinforce and just to re-articulate what Nelly and Kunjan have been saying about the tool's ability to create conversation. At our organization, we've tested and we've piloted the tool with many of our program partners, and it was just beautiful to see how the conversation around the tool has brought out so many concepts and ideas that we as an organization necessarily didn't really know that we need to unpack further. And I really want to just advocate for the tool as far as that is concerned. So the different concepts that are embedded in the tool allows for deeper reflection. There we go. So we are going to look at just one dimension here and just that very, very first question there. As Sarah was saying, each dimension in the tool comprises of different questions or statements that get to the level of that particular dimension. So if you think of dimension A, which is participation, inclusion, and voice that Nelly talked us through earlier, in the tool, you will have 7 statements, I believe, that get to different aspects of that particular dimension. So as far as participation is concerned, exclusion, inclusion, and so on. So enough of me talking about that, and let's get to the simulation. Let's get the simulation going. So that first statement there, or question, does the CLD program ensure the participation of excluded groups? So I would very much want to hear from you. How do you think of excluded groups? So it will be very nice to also hear from an ABCD standpoint. How do you think of and define excluded groups? And this is also maybe an opportunity. You can also reference a little bit the case study here, if you want to use that as an example. When you think about excluded groups, what does excluded groups mean?
I think it means different things in different communities, but I always ask communities, who normally is not included in decision making, which usually, if an external person like me is there, I'm in a room of people who are decision makers. So it's just who's not here.
Yeah, exactly.
So in the case study, I wondered, you know, beyond the government officials and the health professionals, who else is in that community? Where do women connect and gather that they might have some ideas of what would happen?
So those who are not included in the decision-making process, Nelly shared women often are part of that excluded group. Anybody else?
What about, I mean, I didn't see any reference to, it was interesting to me because again, women is not a homogeneous group. This is about gender-based violence. We are talking about high incidence of gender-based violence. I didn't see anything in the work that talked about talking to people who had gone through, who had, you know, survivors of gender-based violence, who about this, like, so, or, you know, women from maybe different ethnic groups. I didn't see anything around that.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, Nelly, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's, you know, it's a funny case study because it's trying to address a problem that stems from marginalization and, I mean, you know, misogyny and lots of other things, but then it's perpetuating some of that by going to the professionals in the government and the what is it, the traditional authorities, I think, traditional leaders. Yeah.
Tons of irony there. And we don't really know from the case study, those traditional leaders, what do they from a demographic look like as well, right?
Well, I think it's worse than irony. It's perpetuation, right? Because gender violence is about power. And the only people who have been included so far are people with power. And so in a sense, the design perpetuates the problem.
Definitely. Great. And so participation then of them is what this dimension and this question wants to get at. So let's see what our options are as far as answers are concerned. So Sarah, if you can go to those responses. So within the tool, we have responses and they are listed on a scale of 1 to 4. And then we also have an answer that reflects if you, for example, do not have enough information on a particular question or statement, that you also have that as an option. But from our standpoint, just from experience in implementing the tool, and we've also realized that sometimes the answers provided in the tool might not necessarily get specifically at the response, or you might not have information that specifically aligns with one of those responses. And in that case, you can easily go then use the scale, right, from 1 to 4 to help you figure out what response you want to give. So I'm going to give like 1 minute maybe for people to look through those responses and to think, reflecting on the case study and also the conversation that we just had. Where would you rate this particular organization as far as them ensuring whether they are including excluded groups? I want you to keep your response, so your score, keep it in your mind, keep it in your head, don't give it yet. And then what we are going to do is I'm going to count to 3. And upon me hitting that number 3, you enter your score into the chat box for us. And that way we can ensure that we don't influence each other when we give our scores. So I'm going to give just a moment for you to think on how you want to score this particular organization. And then I'm going to do the countdown. And then you add your score to the text box. All right. Very good. I'm going to count to 3. On 3, enter your score into the chat box. Everybody ready? So your score from 0 to 4. 1, 2, 3. Okay. 1. Okay, that's great. I think all of the responses are in. We have a big 2, but then we also have 1s and we also have 3s. So we have another 1. That's great. Very good. So I want to hear from you, those maybe 1 or 2 people who scored 2. Can you justify your score? Can you share a little bit with us why you gave a 2? Anybody who scored a 2? Share a little bit your reasoning behind your 2.
I can share a little bit of why I chose to. So it says that implementers have identified potential factors of exclusion and include the views of these community members. So I think that they've done a good job of kind of attempting to include these minority groups, but it just isn't there yet for me. Like, as we said, there's no mention of like empowerment or inclusion of these ethnic groups. And I also noticed in the case study, it seems to equate gender with woman. And it doesn't really account for, you know, people that may not identify as women, because gender and woman are 2 different things. So that's a little bit of why I chose to put 2.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the intention might have been there, but really pulling it through to ensure inclusion, not necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. So I felt like it, you know, there was like an attempt, but it wasn't just there yet.
Yeah. Great. We have some 1s. Who scored a 1? Who wants to elaborate on their choice? Nelly?
I can answer quickly, but then I'm actually curious to hear from Ron, because it looks like he changed his score from a 2 to a 1. I put a 1 because, again, that irony of starting with the premise of identifying an excluded group or a marginalized group being victims of domestic violence or gender-based violence, and then not including their views in this process, really, at any stage. They do a survey of women generally later. But so I think this also speaks a little bit to the fact that, you know, with a scale like this, it'll never be able to factor or to account for every scenario. So here, they sort of analyzed it, they identified it. I wouldn't say they analyzed it, but they identified it, but they didn't include their views even after having identified it.
So maybe lip service there, hey Nelly? Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. Ron, you changed your mind, right? From a 2
No, I changed. I had counting problems. So I wanted the one that said potential factors of exclusion are not analyzed. And it was the second one down. So I put 2, and then I realized that very clearly that is number 1. So
gotcha.
Just math. Yeah, same. I mean, it's quite possible that the traditional leaders engaged are inclusive of a variety of parts of the community, especially women. But it's not stated as so. And even then, if you have traditional leaders, that doesn't necessarily mean you have people with lived experience with the issue.
Absolutely.
So although 80% of women have experienced it, it said, so likelihood if there's women amongst traditional leaders, that's likely. But again, it's people with power, and the challenge being addressed is people who've, you know, had power used against them. So I'm you know, I lean
more
towards exclusion, but but reserved a little judgment.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ron. I just quickly want to pause at Ibrahim. You added a 3. Kujan, you also added a 3. You want to elaborate on that? Ibrahim, maybe?
Yeah, I also changed my mind. I mean, after hearing everyone's reasoning, that makes sense. I guess I just, being someone who, even if I was there, wouldn't be part of those excluded groups. I guess I didn't consider it as much and realize that it was a lot of lip service rather than actual being inclusive. But I mean, that's what this is for, and I'm glad people said that. And so now I also would go down to a 2 or
also down to a 2,
yeah.
2 or 1 maybe. All right. How about you, Konjan? You still feel good about your 3, or you want to maybe change your mind?
Absolutely not. I would give it a 1.
A 1. A 1. All right.
I think the 3 was coming from the point of view of bringing into the discussion the fact that there are many programs who would not even go to the step of consulting and bringing in the people who had, who were there, like the traditional leaders, or looking at the health people, or even the women or youth later on for the survey bit, right? So there are many programs who would not do that. And I think what I really did want to bring that out and point to that.
That's very good. So we should then, from an organizational standpoint, we should give a little bit of credit then toward that, Kunjan. And so it's very good that we could then include that as in our comment box, if you don't mind, Christiane. Okay, good. So we have a bunch of 2s and we now have 1s. Ibrahim, did you go with a 1 or a 2? With a 2. All right. So if my math is not mistaking me, is not letting me down here, I think we have more 2s than 1s, right? So will all of you feel okay if we find consensus with a 2? If we put our score as a 2, since we have more 2s, those who do not have a 2, does that feel okay with you if we find consensus on 2? Yeah? All right. Good. So, Christiane, you can put in there then for us a number 2, unless anybody else feels otherwise. But it's very important to note that Christiane, who took comments for us, identify and very explicitly listed out all the reasons why, all the negotiation and the conversations that we have around our final score. And I think that is very much an emphasis here that we really want to illustrate to you all as well, is that yes, we might have our final score as a 2, but we came to that 2 through conversation. We came to that 2 seeing that other people, might not feel strongly about the 2, and those opinions of those who are not aligned with the score of a number 2, we want to have those opinions listed in our comment box for our future selves as an organization, so that we can come back to that. Looking at the time clock there, Kunjan, I think I'm going to stop there, but all of this is sort of just to give you an idea as to how we envision the tool being used by organizations.
Thank you so much, Elaine. It was, again, a very quick simulation, but as Elaine said, that the idea for us was to really illustrate the process of using the tool. We've heard of different ways in which organizations have used this tool. We ourselves in the study used it on reports. We've seen organizations do it through a back and forth within just their teams, but we very, very strongly advise that the real purpose and the real beauty of this tool is if you carry out this exercise with community members, with community leaders, with the local people who are, the local facilitators, the people who are there every day, who are conducting whatever programs you have, along with the program staff. And the reason, I'll answer that in a bit, Ron. I'll just come to your question. That's a great question. And the reason we say that is because, and the reason I chose 3 purposely in that exercise was really to say that this was a very different audience, but we've done this so many times, these trainings, and oftentimes people start with saying, oh yeah, they consulted, they did a good job, there was participation, and they give it a 3, or even I've seen people give it a 4. And then there would be other people in the room who would turn around and say, no, what about this group? This is missing. How is it this? How is, who's not there? And that spirals into a discussion of beginning to recognize, for instance, gender. Is it just about women? What about people with other sexual orientation, other preferences? What are we doing about LGBTQ plus people, right? People with, so all of those things get missed out in general conversation. The reason we introduced a question without even going to options is to just try and have those conversations, to try and unpack that. And that is why for us, the process is more important than the score at the end, which was really, as you saw, just an average that we arrived at. And there are many different ways of doing it. People have used it in communities where people have actually debated and said, no, we don't agree with the two. So when Eileen asked that, can everybody live with the two? We've had situations where people have said, no, we won't because of this. But all that does is it's a process of discussion and engagement. And it's very important for us as people who are, supporting that program to know that, because we understand. We've had instances when the person who designed the case study believed that she had designed a very participatory process, or on one of the questions where she believed the answer was yes, and then somebody pointed out why it wasn't yes, why they would score it very lowly. And then she realized that it was in my head. It's like we think if we had done the thing around accountability mechanisms, for instance, we think, oh, we've created provisions to have feedback, right? We have a box where anybody from the community can go and put in their feedback into it, and we'll know what's going on. So we have a process there. And then you talk to the community in this discussion when you discuss the tool, and they'll go like, yeah, sure, you do. That box is right in front of the, the village head's house. And so the village head can literally see who is going in and putting feedback and complaints there. We're never going to use that. Or you have a mobile number. Well, I don't have money on my phone, or I don't even have a mobile phone or a phone access to call that number and give feedback. So very often we think we have built-in provisions and we are doing things, and we are not doing them. And the whole process of discussion and capturing the discussion and trying to agree on a score is designed for us to kind of, unpack those things and become aware of them. Because that's going to take me to the part that I'm going to be talking about now, which is, well, you've done through this exercise with the community, you've spent a day doing this. Now what happens? Well, you get the graph that Sarah showed us, right? You'll get a graph which will show you that. And by looking at the graph, you can see we're doing well on this, we're not doing well on this. Broad picture. But that's not the real story. You will go back to your comments and see what were the things that we were not doing well? Why were we scored so lowly on this? Some of those things you'll think, well, we can do it. Yes, we should do it. Other things you would be like, well, at this stage in our work, it's just not possible to do this. And that's okay. But the whole idea is that the decision is made together, being cognizant of how people feel about the program, what needs to be done with the program. And it can be used in multiple ways. The tool can be used, you see here a multi-colored graph on the screen. You could be, if you're an organization that has this program in 5 different countries or 3 different communities, doesn't even need to be different countries, 3 different communities. You can have them on one and see, well, how are we doing? We seem to be doing better in the orange community than in the green community. Why is it? What was different there? What can we learn from it? So, or this can be over time. It could be that green is where we started out when we started the program. We decided we needed to make course corrections, and 3 years down the line, now we feel we are at orange. And well, that's improvement for sure, right? So there are different ways we organizationally can use this. But to get back to Ron's question, and then I'm going to hand it over to Nelly, about how do community leaders or organizations access this tool to use it? So for now, we have a mobile version of the tool for this. And the way it's been used is that, well, the facilitator, and it shouldn't be a facilitator, we recommend it shouldn't be a facilitator from the community who's been involved in the project, because obviously there'll be a bias and a power dynamic. But there will be a facilitator who will be doing what Eileen did, which is sharing a question, talking about the project with the community, sharing a question saying, do you think that in this work, we are really being participatory? Who all are being included? Who are not being included? You know, so you have that discussion. And then with the community members, you may not even show the options because the options are too dense for a lot of people. And, you know, there's a lot of jargon there. It's more for us. So you would just, based on that conversation, ask community members, well, if you're talking about 0 to, 4, and in different communities, in some communities, you use numbers. In other communities, you use smileys. There are different ways of asking the communities to assess the performance, depending on the context of your community that you're working on. So, they would just score it on that, on cards, on placards, by a verbal vote. It can be different ways, Ron. Again, different organizations have done different things around it. So there is no one right method, I would say, to do it. I think it depends really on the context in which you're using it. But you would not use it with the options. You would use it with the facilitator having the discussion. And that's why we spend so much time in our trainings talking about and unpacking the dimensions, the questions that we need to ask and what we need to look for. I hope that answers your question. And Aline's team has actually used it. I don't know if you used it with community members and leaders included, Aline, or you did it just with the program and the local partners?
No, we just did it with our program partners. And as you were saying, Kunjan, it brings out really, really important and interesting conversations because what program partners think they are doing might not necessarily reflect, might not necessarily be exactly what from a more objective standpoint, and they think they are doing. So it's an incredibly good reflective exercise, if anything else.
Nellie, over to you to take us to the close.
Thank you, and I will be very quick because we want to leave time for Aline to harvest for us, I think.
I will.
But so this was just a really brief introduction to the tool as it stands now. I hope some of the key messages around it have come through, how it's a tool for discussion. It's living, it's breathing. We want input, and it's for reflection. It's not meant to be about judgment. So as we close with that, and with just that little taste of it, we're curious to hear from you all. Do you have any immediate impressions on it? Is it something that you might use? What worked? What seems like it might be missing? Would you be interested in learning more about how to use it and how to apply it in different kinds of contexts with communities, with programs, with program staff, etc.? So it's also been a lot of information in a short time. So we also remain available for any reflections that you might have, in the coming days. Yeah, I'll just pause for a moment and see if anyone has anything that they want to share at this point or in the chat box.
Oh, thank you. I've got to run to another meeting, but I can see in the course of my trainings, I often run across groups who could really benefit from this sort of assessment and reflection process. I will send them your way as I meet them.
Great, and I think, with the ABCD perspective, and it'd be really important and useful to bring that in and to see how this stands with that in mind. And also, as we mentioned, we have the version for communities to use coming out. So I think that will apply to some of the things also that it's going to be super interesting. And also, the things that Gord was talking about at the beginning, hopefully we can connect with him as well once that is out and up on the website.
I can think of a lot of applications for a community-based version.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much. I have to run to my next meeting, but it's good to meet all of you.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks,
Thank you
Ron.
so much.
Thank you.
And as Gunjan just put in the chat box, her email is there. You all can reach out with any additional impressions or feedback as it comes to you. We've got 2 minutes. Aline.
I'm going to harvest. I'm going to harvest a minute. I have 3 things. Wait, yeah, 3 things that I want to, that for me immediately comes to mind that I want to reflect on a little bit, and I'll be very quick. We've been a small group of people, like-minded people with the same objectives and goals and visions in mind. And that reminded me of a book that a brothers Heath wrote, Dan Heath, and now I'm blanking on what the other brother's called. And the point of that is change happen in small bits. And so even though we're a small group together, change can still happen, right? So within all of us, doesn't matter how big we are, as whether we are in mass or whether we are just a handful of people, change still happens, and change can happen in small ways. Then the second thing, and I think I'll stop at my second point, is the approach that was mentioned. I think Ron mentioned it about fingerprints. And I think the process of developing this tool, which is still an ongoing process, is also those fingerprints, right? Fingerprints is to see what participation looks like. And I think in developing this tool, the whole tool is just covered with fingerprints from everybody and everyone on their feedback and their reactions to the tool, their input in the tool. So I think the participation, and by participation, to reference Ron here, the fingerprints left on the tool is what makes this tool strong going forward. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Aline. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone. I know a lot of people have had to hop off as we've come to the hour, but that was great. Thank you for the flexibility to everyone with it going a little bit differently than we had anticipated. And we look forward to continuing to discuss with you all.
Thanks. And as your Zoom admin, I learned a lot. So I appreciate the session. It was great to sit in and listen and learn. Thanks.
Thanks, Howard.
Thanks, Howard. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all. Bye.